So much for joining us for our July webinar, the Vanderbilt Nurse Case, how we got here, where do we go next, with Kyle Sweet. Before I hand it over to Kyle, I do just want to let you know that we will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A throughout the session, so feel free to submit your questions at any time and we will try to address them the best that we can. And with that, I don't want to waste any further time, so I will pass it off to Kyle. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate it. And everybody else who's here from the Collaborative for Accountability Improvement at the University of Washington. We have Karen Brigham and Paulina, who's also here, who are an incredible resource. So I really encourage people to reach out to them if they have any questions or suggestions for content. They're just a wonderful resource for all of us in this space. Just a very quick, brief bio. I know if we get a lawyer wound up talking about themselves, that could take over the whole webinar. My name's Kyle Sweet. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer representing healthcare providers throughout the country, based out of Oklahoma City and Tulsa. I've been a board member of the Collaborative for several years now, and I'm chairing the Attorney Alliance Committee. And those are some great programs that I'm excited to kind of weave into the kind of the discussion I'd like to have today. I really encourage, we do have some questions and comments that people shared prior to the webinar kicking off today, and we'll address those. Also, I really encourage you to help us make this a discussion and not a lecture or a rant, which any of us who are passionate about this can easily fall into. So please be liberal with your use of the chat function. Nicole is going to kind of moderate that and interrupt with comments or questions. And so please feel free to use those. I also wanted to kind of give just a brief caveat that this is in no way a criticism or takedown of the way Vanderbilt handled this terrible medical error that resulted in patient harm. In fact, I think we should all be grateful that an institution as well regarded as Vanderbilt has been, has not been obstructive to people in healthcare having this discussion. And I think the way we should all look at this is not that I can't believe this happened at Vanderbilt, one of the premier medical institutions in the world, but rather there, but the grace of God go we. If this can happen at a Vanderbilt, then it can happen literally anywhere in the United States or the world for that matter. And so I'm grateful for this experience to talk about this tragedy, hopefully so we can learn from it and we can feel empowered and passionate and turn those feelings into action. So real quick, I'm going to kind of set out the timeline of the Vanderbilt nurse case. It'll take a few minutes, but I want to make sure that we're all kind of understanding from the same basic standpoint of facts. And I tried to, in kind of putting together a timeline, I've relied heavily on the coverage provided by the Tennessean, which is the large newspaper in Nashville where Vanderbilt is located, because they used essentially only public source information in the formation of a timeline. So basically on December 24th, 2017, Charlene Murphy was admitted to Vanderbilt Hospital with a subdural hematoma. 2 days later, her condition had improved where discharge was contemplated and she was going to need a scan. At that point, she, in the radiology department, as part of that scan, it was intended that she receive a sedative known as Versed, which is probably it's very common medication for that usage. And instead was accidentally given a dose of vecuronium, which is a paralytic agent, according to federal investigators' report. And the result was that the patient, after administration, was rendered brain dead. On December 27th, the patient died after life support was removed. And later that day, two Vanderbilt neurologists reported her death to the Davidson County Medical Examiner's Office without mentioning the medication error or the actual medication that was the paralytic agent that caused her hypoxic event, leading ultimately to her death. Based on the information provided by Vanderbilt, the medical examiner does not independently investigate the death and deems it natural causes. In January of 2018, in the wake of the patient's death, Vanderbilt officials take several actions that are argued to have obscured the fatal medication error from the government or the public. The allegation was the error was not reported to state or federal agencies as required by law, or the Joint Commission, which is it's a recommendation for reporting, but not a requirement. In early of 2018, we don't know the date, Vanderbilt negotiates an out-of-court settlement with the family, which has what I feel is an industry standard non-disclosure confidentiality agreement that is essentially a contract that precludes either of the party from discussing the underlying terms of the settlement or the facts of the case. Obviously, no one shares their release in full of all claims, which is the contract that we're talking about here. But those are generally construed to be binding mutually on both of the parties. So in May of 2018, so fast forward a few months, the nurse who was involved with the administration of the Vecuronium rather than the Versed, Nurse Vaught, she'd been terminated earlier in January of 2018. She begins working as a coordinator at a facility as a throughput coordinator, not in a nursing capacity, but a position that required a nursing license. In October 3rd of 2018, a few months later, an anonymous tip alerts state and federal health officials to the non-reported medication error that was responsible for Miss Murphy's death. 20 days later, the Tennessee Department of Health, which is responsible for licensing and investigating medical professionals, decides not to pursue disciplinary action against Nurse Vaught. In a letter to Vanderbilt, the agency's investigations director says the nurse's case did not constitute a violation of the statutes and/or rules governing the nursing profession in Tennessee. And on the same day, Nurse Vaught is sent a letter saying essentially the same thing, and that the matter did not warrant further action. A week later, beginning October 31st to November 8th, in response to the anonymous tip, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducts a surprise inspection at Vanderbilt. The inspection confirms that Miss Murphy died from an accidental dosage of Vecuronium at Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt did not report the medication error to the government or the medical examiner, according to the inspection report. And that takes us to late November of 2018. And now we're about a year after, almost a year after Miss Murphy's death by the medication error. And the circumstances of the fatal medication error become public for the first time when CMS releases an investigation report that details without identifying the nurse or the patient, Miss Murphy, CMS threatens to suspend Vanderbilt's Medicare payments, crippling any hospital's main revenue source if Vanderbilt cannot prove that it has taken steps to prevent a similar incident from happening again. Vanderbilt quickly responded with a plan of correction that appeases the federal agency and secures its Medicare reimbursements. Vanderbilt never released a plan of correction publicly, and the Tennessean later obtained a copy of it through public records request. Fast forward a few months, February 4th, 2019, Nurse Vaught is publicly identified for the first time when arrested on a criminal indictment for her role in Miss Murphy's death. She's charged at that time with reckless homicide and impaired adult abuse. The court documents also reveal the patient's identity for the first time. In an interview with the Tennessean, Miss Murphy's family members were quoted as saying that she would have forgiven Nurse Vaught for this error. February 5th of 2019, Vanderbilt executives speak about the fatal error during a meeting of the Tennessee Board of Licensing Healthcare Facilities, which is responsible for disciplining hospitals in Tennessee. Vanderbilt's CEO admits the death wasn't reported to state regulators and said the hospital's response was too limited, quote unquote. Vanderbilt officials also confirmed for the first time that they did in fact negotiate an out-of-court settlement with Miss Murphy's family, and the board took no disciplinary action against the hospital at that time. 3 days later, in a GoFundMe post to raise money for her legal defense, Nurse Vaught appears to admit she made a mistake but does not elaborate. She quoted saying, I feel very strongly that setting the precedent that nurses should be indicted and incarcerated for inadvertent medical errors is dangerous, and she wrote. February 20th, 2019, Nurse Vaught makes her first court appearance and pleads not guilty to all of the criminal charges. Next month, March 27th, in court records, prosecutors revealed for the first time more details about the nurse's criminal case. Investigators allege that she made 10 separate and distinct errors while giving the wrong medication to Miss Murphy, including overlooking multiple warning signs that she had the wrong medication. Court records state that the nurse had to have looked directly at a warning which read "warning, paralyzing agent" before injecting the drug. Court documents also said the nurse admitted this to investigators. In the fall of 2019, August of 2019, at the request of law enforcement, Nashville medical examiners re-examined the circumstances of Miss Murphy's death, and now, aware of the medication error, changed the official manner of death to accidental from natural. September 27th, the Tennessee Department of Health reversed its prior decision not to pursue professional discipline against Nurse Vaught. Instead, the agency charged Nurse Vaught with 3 infractions before the Tennessee Board of Nursing, and they refused to explain why it changed the error. In late October, mid-November of 2019, because that's now facing the legal proceedings in a criminal trial and a professional discipline trial, her lawyer sought delay of it so that the things said in the professional discipline matter before the Tennessee Board of Health could not be used against her in the criminal case, which obviously would invoke Fifth Amendment privilege issues. So fast forward December 15th, the Tennessean Report publishes a story detailing the actions taken by Vanderbilt, and for the first time, it begins publicly through quotes of the Murphy's family to essentially have allegations indicating a cover-up. Spring of 2020, COVID pandemic hits, which essentially scuttles any schedule for the litigation of either the underlying disciplinary hearing or the criminal case. In July 22nd, Ms. Vaught's medical discipline hearing finally occurs. Testimony is taken. During that, Ms. Vaught defended herself, but while acknowledging the medication error and accepting complete fault for it, said that at the time, Vanderbilt was struggling with a problem that prevented communication between the EMR and medication cabinets in the hospital pharmacy. She and her lawyer said this was causing delays at accessing medications, in the hospital's short-term work around was to override the safeguards on the cabinet so they could get drugs quickly and get them accessed by patients as needed. Overriding, which is what they described it, was something they did as a part of their everyday practice, according to Nurse Vaught's testimony, and you couldn't get a bag of fluids for a patient timely without using an override function. The next day, the Tennessee Board of Nursing revoked her nursing license. March 21st, 2022, the criminal trial began, and 4 days later, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the criminally negligent homicide and gross abuse and gross neglect of an impaired adult. That was the charge that was eventually accepted, and Nurse Vaught was subsequently sentenced to about 3 years of probation on that single criminal charge. So thanks for your patience. So now we all kind of are able to sing from the same sheet of music as to what happened. And none of us know the details, because none of us have met the Murphy family or their attorney, and none of us have discussed this case with Ms. Vaught or the prosecutors or the officials at Vanderbilt. So that's kind of our basic framework from a public information standpoint that we have to go on. And I think it's important because it gives us information that we can use and take some takeaways. So how did we get there? In modern health, Nicole,
then we did have one question come in while you were talking, and I'm not sure if you can touch on this or not,
Sure.
But if you're able to, can you touch on the difference between med mal coverage and criminal insurance coverage, and the fact that no private or company insurances cover criminal allegations?
Okay, great question. And thank you. Next time, just wave your arms, Nicole, and I'll stop. So great question. And so we have, obviously in the United States, we really have 3 different types of legal avenues where someone who's professionally licensed can have some type of a consequence. The first is obviously, civil and that's, a medical malpractice suit. Another one is a criminal, where it's different judges. You have a jury. The standard of review is different for a jury, than it is in a civil case. And then there's also administrative. And in this case, we kind of have elements of all 3. The civil case was never filed because Vanderbilt settled out of court. The criminal case, Ms. Vaught would have had to have gone on GoFundMe or mortgaged her home or borrowed money or whatever, because there's no insurance available for a criminal act based off the public policy consideration that criminal acts are not insurable. So if you have a case as a nurse or a physician where you are, it's a civil case, and that your medical malpractice coverage will pay for it. It will also often pay, though it's usually caps depending on the insurance provider, administrative investigations or disciplinary actions by your licensing agency, but it will not cover criminal actions. It by law it can't. So in a case like this, I think what we see, because Ms. Vaught had been terminated, and her employment was what provided her protection for medical malpractice with Vanderbilt, they've settled that case. So she's without any coverage for the underlying administrative action on her nursing license. So that's going to come out of pocket, and that's expensive, but not nearly as expensive as a criminal case where you need expert witnesses. You need all of that. So it's really a matter, they could not have covered that type of coverage even if they wanted to. So you're left with a nurse who has no resources with a significant expense coming up for her. So that's how we got to a point where there was no insurance coverage available for her.
And then just a quick follow-up on that. Do you recommend that nurses have medical malpractice insurance?
In my 25 years, I'd say that's the top 3 questions I get all the time with nurses. And it's a difficult question to answer, but I'm going to be blunt about it. I'm going to be non-lawyerly, and I'm not going to give an evasive answer, I promise you. I think it is, in a modern day of hospitals and the amount of coverage they have, there's only one argument for a nurse not to have her own liability coverage, and that is it can make them a target, because historically we did not have to disclose insurance coverage if you were a defendant in a case, and now you do. There's a trend away from individually naming nurses in medical malpractice cases. In fact, even naming physicians when they're employed by a healthcare system, or if it's an ostensible agency case. So a plaintiff lawyer would have to have some understanding that the nurses may have their own liability coverage. Therefore, they would name them, because now they've got another insurance carrier in there. And those limits are usually $500,000 to $1 million in coverage. And plaintiff lawyers, is their due diligence, for doing their job, is to find out what all insurance is available that could potentially satisfy the claim that they're making against those defendants. And so the only argument I think that could be justifiable for a nurse not wanting it is a case like Miss Vogt. Also a case such as where they're concerned about having, being left out to dry, or feeling as if that they're going to be a target because they do have insurance. So ultimately, I think you're a professional, you protect yourself. My recommendation is that nurses obtain liability insurance. Now, granted, one thing to remember, your employer's coverage will typically come first, but that will be something that will be discussed between those insurance companies. So you don't have to have it. It's not a term of or condition of employment like it is often for physicians, but it is something that does bear serious consideration. And ultimately, that's a decision I think you have to make based off your own risk tolerance. But most nurses are judgment proof. So if you are individually named in a lawsuit and the hospital is going to be sued with you, the hospital is responsible based off respondent superior and vicarious liability for your actions. So in this case, even if Nurse Vogt had been sued along with Vanderbilt would have been responsible, and the family most likely, with rarest of exceptions, would not have pursued a claim individually against her, because if the principal, Vanderbilt, settles the case and the case brought against them is respondent superior, then that extinguishes the actions, the claims that can be made against the other defendants on those legal theories. So it varies by where you are, but ultimately, I think it's your own risk tolerance as a nurse, and having insurance gives you peace of mind, and it's well worth the investment. It's not usually a lot of money like it can be for certain physician disciplines. So if you need to jump in again, please do. I want to kind of go into kind of the how do we get here? And basically, so when we ask the question, how did we get here? The real question is, why would a prosecutor charge a nurse for a mistake? And I've asked that question a lot over the last few months in light of this verdict that came out. And I met with district attorneys from from a lot of different jurisdictions, from rural areas who would only have, several, critical access hospitals, or, district attorneys who have an area of multi-million people and large multiple health systems. And ultimately, the consensus that I discussed with them that came back to me was they do not want to. They view this, the Vanderbilt Nurse Case, as a serious aberration that resulted out of frustration and a perception of cover-up. Now, no one has accused Vanderbilt of a cover-up. No one's made that allegation in any type of regulatory or criminal proceedings, but that's the frustration and the perception that was had that every step along the way, sufficient accurate information was not given to have a better understanding of what happened. And so I think what we have is in healthcare, we're living something we have not seen before. There's societal changes. We have what's called social inflation that you'll hear a lot about, rising verdicts. We're in a hardening insurance market. We have the post-COVID honeymoon is over with healthcare. We've seen the Vanderbilt Nurse Case. And so there's a lot of trends that we're seeing that I think reflect an overall societal thing of power disparity. And, historically, and I've tried a lot of cases every year for 25 years, and it's changed in the recent years when we do jury selection and we ask jurors about their healthcare experiences and how that would bias them for or against a healthcare defendant or for or against a patient. And the answers have been concerning at times, because what we're seeing is a reflection of the overall disparity of power. The health systems have the power. The physicians are becoming increasingly more and more employed within those systems and not independent. They don't know who's quarterbacking their care. They don't have a person they can go to who knows the most about it. They're handed off from hospitalist to hospitalist on inpatient admissions. And there's a sense of, I don't know what's going on in my care. I don't know what's next for me. And that has bled over into the common public's understanding of healthcare. It's confusing. It's a behemoth. It's something I don't understand. And it's something I have to fight through bureaucracy and online roadblocks to be able to manage my own care. And so there's a frustration. And I know no one is more frustrated with that than than people who live in the system and feel sometimes powerless to try to change. So I think it's a culmination of a lot of this that resulted in the Davidson County District Attorney in Tennessee making that difficult decision to say, I've got to do this. I have no other choice to protect the public than to file criminal charges against this individual who is not unlike any other individuals at hospitals around the country who made a terrible, awful, tragic mistake. And so what it does is it's evidence of a lack of trust in institutions, which is common and prevalent in our society. The ones that are supposed to protect us. We've lived with this since 2007. People had their retirement, evaporate. They didn't trust the banking institutions. We've had political movements start over lack of trust in institutions. So we have a real suspicion of institutions and systems that self-police, lawyers, bankers, healthcare. None of us are immune from this feeling of people that we're all the elites who are out here shuffling the deck in our favor, and the little man or woman is entering this system that's a grinder, and they don't want to, and they don't understand it. And we need to understand that we are all in professions that self-police, and if there's a perception from the outside that we're not effectively self-policing, we make ourselves subject to these cases that we're either going to label them by our response an aberration, or we're going to label them by a lack of response as potentially a trend. So lack of faith in the values of healthcare. That's one of the things that leads up to this. We see on all the websites, if we go to everyone who's on this call, every hospital you go to, every hospital you work at, they all have the same common thing. And that is, when you get up on the website, it is brag central. There's badges and statements. And if you look at their quality of care, their initiatives, they have programs. Many of them, the largest institutions for sure, have programs. No one had more robust and even award-winning programs like an amazing institution like Vanderbilt. And then they weren't lived. So we have these corporate values like all of our many corporations in this country, in this modern world. And there's a disconnect between our stated corporate values, which appear to be bumper stickers we put on our cars, and then we have our behaviors that live within these systems. Yes, Nicole.
I think this is a good time to jump in with a comment from Dr. Perlman, and he says, I'm curious how you can say that Vanderbilt should not be faulted in this situation. They fired the nurse without following just culture principles. They failed to report this event to external agencies, which is at the very least irresponsible. Lastly, until CMS came in after a whistleblower spoke up, Vanderbilt did no investigation to address system issues.
Okay, a great question. And I think I tried to use very careful words. And when lawyers do that, sometimes we step on our own feet. When I said is, I don't want this to be a takedown of Vanderbilt or a critical, something where we're launching into a technical, critical analysis of the steps taken by Vanderbilt. I think if we do that, and there's certainly, I think it's hard to do that because we don't have all of the information. We have what's been, made public by newspapers based off of public source, Freedom of Information Act requests and the like, and some limited statements have been made by these different entities. So my concern is that we wind up taking apart the person who made the mistake. In this case, obviously, I'm not saying Vanderbilt is without fault. I'm saying Vanderbilt, like any one of the institutions that I represent, or any of the institutions represented by people on this call, are if Vanderbilt's doing this, then so the heck are we. And probably, in way more problematic ways. So I think we lose the ability to study this and reflect on our own processes within our systems by attacking or being, attack's not the right word, being overly critical in this situation of studying information that we don't even have the full picture. So what I'm advocating for is, let's take the common public facts that have been disclosed and let's look inward on the way we are ourselves performing, me with my clients and the different institutions around the country I'm involved with, everyone on this call, because we are all doing these things. And Vanderbilt will have to account for their own, their own corporate values and the problems that led to this case here. We're not going to solve that on this call, but what we can do is learn from this lesson. And what I want to do is have the people on this call feel empowered that we can go back to the institutions that we represent or the communities that we live in, if we're on the plaintiff or the patient advocate side, and have some type of a process and understand more about what things can help prevent these types of things or minimize the effect of them happening again. And that leads us to this lack of faith that it had. It's a culmination, I think, of a deny and defend mentality that we have in this country with our medical errors that result in patient harm. And obviously, the vast majority of cases I've handled in my 25 years, it was good care, and the conscious decision was made to defend good care. But a lot of times, we're denying that there was any bad care, anytime, in any situation. All care can be defended. Circle the wagons. Let's shut down communications to families. We're all familiar with the Donald Trump National Enquirer relationship, and politics aside, I think it's a really good illustration negatively of what the deny defend mentality and unintended policy that happens in healthcare. And that is this: the National Enquirer served to capture stories and kill that story by making a financial payment that locked everybody up from being able to talk about it. We do the same thing. We could decry that. Oh, that's awful, everything. Now in healthcare, the argument can be made by the deny and defend ethos. We do the same thing. We go out, we risk management may hear of something from quality, could be a reaction to a sentinel event, and risk and claims with the best of intentions, attempting to do their job and capture risk that would expose the institution or the providers to greater liability risk. And the flag goes up, and everyone in quality shuts down. We can't talk. The message that we as lawyers send and that we as risk and claims professionals send is that this has to be shut down. No more communication with the family, even when there are incredible programs like a Candor, Macrame, any of the various CRP programs, the communication resolution programs that exist, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about later. Those can exist, but they're not being fully implemented because there's really not a proper process to allow risk and claims and defense lawyers and plaintiff lawyers to have a lane that coexists with the CRP process, which may very well be the ethical standard that the institution wants for itself, wants for its patients. So we in the litigation world on all sides of it need to understand, and I want to tell you my experience, and this is an example. I've had this type of situation numerous times, both myself being confessional, and I've seen it all the time in other attorneys. So here's my experience with the deny and defend leading up to where we are today. Quality department is responding to an event. Risk and claims finds out, sentinel event, they're aware of it. Consults defense panel lawyer, alarm bells are rung saying, oh no, you can't tell the family anything. We don't know everything yet. We need to have an investigation. We need to properly understand everything before we say anything about it. We have to investigate. So everyone is shut down. We got to invoke privilege over this process. The family gets frustrated. Their unanswered questions drives them to a plaintiff lawyer who tells them that the only language the hospital understands is money. A lawsuit ensues, expensive discovery, and a defense lawyer thinking the whole time, thank God those goody two-shoes quality folks never allowed anyone to talk to that family. Imagine how bad it could be then. And it could be way worse. Trial date is set, $500,000 is run up in legal litigation costs. A mediation is called when the plaintiff demands $25 million and a settlement occurs. It's mediated. The hospital pays, let's say, $3 million to settle the case. The actual parties sign a binding contract promising not to talk about it, which makes them feel hollow and dissatisfied. The plaintiff lawyer and the defense lawyer both tell their colleagues, thank God for me. Meanwhile, nothing changes, and that's welcome to medical malpractice law in the modern age. And so that is part of that thing, I think, that systemically drives this dissatisfaction within and without healthcare that allows us to have this mentality that we're not really taking serious the ability to utilize and deploy the quality and patient safety initiatives that we usually already have and the policies in place to live that cultural value. So we as plaintiff lawyers, defense lawyers, admin and risk can't claim the moral high ground of patient first safety whilst making settlement agreements on a patient not disclosing any of the details of the settlement of the case, et cetera. It's not ethical, I think, for us to try to have a focus ethically on capturing the bad care. And we do things we talk about, oh, we do early disclosure. You know, we do early settlement. We want to settle these cases early. Well, that's the capture and kill mentality of these stories. We as a lawyer, I am denying my healthcare provider the satisfaction professionally of learning more and the feeling of continuing their obligation, their ethical obligations to their patient who may have been harmed by their care. You know, when you have a patient who's harmed by your care as a provider, you're now married to them in a way you're not married to anyone else. You still owe that patient ethical obligations to do no harm. And so if we are, by our actions, going to put that patient on a collision course of continued harm because we will not truly be transparent, we will worry too much about liability exposure, then in my experience, we do the very thing that makes liability exposure worse. And that is shut down, don't communicate, don't work towards resolution of understanding what happened, much less a resolution that provides the patient's needs are met, that we resource care, we communicate with them, and if warranted, engage in some type of a financial resolution for them. The good news is, a few years ago, I did a thing in Oklahoma City called Leadership OKC, and where we were exposed to the whole panoply of social ills that can happen to any metropolitan area. And I remember going into that thinking, oh God, this is gonna be so depressing. No one knows. We can't. Our government can't solve homelessness. We can't solve the inner city educational lack of funds and all these types of things. And what I quickly learned was we have the answers. It's not up to people like us to come up with the answers. We already have them. And the answer is in the healthcare setting, our CRPs, communication resolution programs. And they go by many names. Candor is one of them. Many different areas of the country have a CRP that bears some type of a name that's reflective of the value that they have. And many of them are working. All of them are working when fully deployed. So what my position on this is, we don't need to feel the pressure and the fear that this Vanderbilt Nurse Case is going to be a trend unless we don't take heed from this and recognize that we need to live the cultural values that we espouse. And so, right now, I honestly think when the early resolutions I've done, early resolution is not a communication resolution program. All right, early resolution of a case where you have terrible liability exposure is good business. All right, and I don't disagree with that, but we should not claim the moral high ground about early resolution and lie to ourselves thinking we have a CRP. It's not. Just telling the patient who's lawyered up that you want to go have a mediation with them before the case is filed. Good. I'm glad that's happening, but that's not a CRP. That's not the type of ethical obligations that we as lawyers owe to our healthcare providers, or on the plaintiff side, that they owe to their patient to get them through a process where they have the questions. And real quick, then I think we'll have some other questions come up. I've been doing this a long time. Other people on this have as well. Every single deposition I've taken of a plaintiff, and this is an informal poll I've conducted with defense lawyers from all over the country, and this is a universal truth amongst people who do what I do. When we're deposing a plaintiff, one of the first things we say is, why did you sue in this case? Invariably, no one's ever said, money, I want more money, I want to be rich, I want a second home, I want to do that. They never say that. The impetus is the same, and that answer is, no one would talk to me, no one would answer my questions. I just wanted to find out what happened. And now, granted, that there can always be secondary gain, and many times there is by the time the litigation is over, because that becomes the only measure of revenge. It becomes the measure of success for a plaintiff. It becomes the measure of feeling that they've been made whole. And we are continuing that to feed into that problem and make it worse when we don't recognize the paradigmatic shift that is happening with our ethical obligations legally to our client to understand theirs in their ongoing relationship that they have to have with the patient, as well as the plaintiff lawyers, and recognizing and ushering their patients to a more holistic and wholesome ending to their event that resulted in patient harm. So, time for questions before we kind of get to the next phase of where we go next.
We do have a couple of questions that have come in. The first was, who is behind the criminal charges being filed if the DA didn't want to bring them? And if the frustration was with Vanderbilt, why go after the nurse?
Okay, that's a great question. A lot of times it's really the low-hanging fruit. My understanding in the Vanderbilt case was it could have been an assistant attorney or someone from the Attorney General's office. I thought it was the Davidson County District Attorney. In any event, both state prosecutors who are representing the Attorney General's office have the legal authority to investigate and prosecute criminal actions. So does every district attorney. So typically, the way this would happen is a district attorney would hear about it. In this case, the Department of Health, CMS came in federally and did their surprise inspection, learned what it was, disclosed that, submitted it to the Department of Health, who then reversed their decision on the nurse and then went after her. A lot of times, why they chose the nurse to go after and why not the hospital is the hospital come up with a corrective action plan, and that typically satisfies CMS. They don't want to cripple Vanderbilt and say you're completely blackballed from receiving any Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement payments. That would ultimately result in layoffs, worse care for people. And so hospitals have leverage. It's like the old example that people have said before. If I owe my banker $100,000, he has power over me. If I owe my banker $100 million, I have power over my banker. And I think that's something we see in healthcare is that, third-party payors at times have been really effective with flexing their leverage over the healthcare provider systems. And we're seeing that in situations like this, where the decision ultimately to prosecute that nurse ultimately was derived by a third-party payor flexing their power on state agencies that receive this funding and on the hospitals who receive it as well. So now, how do we do that in a way that meets the public need of the public feeling like they're being empowered, that results in patient safety, that results in people in healthcare talking about this? Hello, that's what we're doing right here, right? We're talking about this. So from a prosecutor's standpoint, right, wrong, or indifferent, this prosecution was a major success. Now, not for the launching anyone's political ambitions, but for getting healthcare providers' attention and letting them see the fact that when you make systemic errors that are overridden and consciously done, and that are, rise to a level of beyond mere violation of the standard of care, and in this case can, be gross negligence, that there will be and can be legal consequences to it. To me, this is not an action. To me, Rodonda Vaught, the nurse, is a pawn. She is a pawn in this case, and she received a punishment worthy of what she did. And she expressed a certain level of contriteness that would satisfy any prosecutor I've ever known. The real target in this case was us. The real target in this case was healthcare writ large. That's who the message was made for. Because otherwise it's really hard for a prosecutor to take action against a large health system and result in the type of change that can occur by creating a furor by healthcare providers and a feeling of insecurity. And I think that prosecutor would probably say, or someone like him or her, welcome to the world of the patient. We feel insecure, we feel powerless, we feel scared. And anytime we're entering your doors, that's the way we feel. And please have the systems in place that you brag having on your websites. Utilize them, make it a cultural value where your value is not capturing liability, but learning and facilitating care for the people who've been injured, and also the wellness of the people who made a mistake. And that's the beauty of the CRP process, is all of those stakeholders have a role. And what we're efforting to do through educational outreach like this and sharing and having dialogues like this is to better understand and empower each other to make sure that we're resourcing these programs that many of us have and are not fully utilizing. And so our goal is to make sure that we have these in every hospital, not only in the United States, but worldwide, so that we can mitigate patient harm when it occurs, and we can handle it in an ethically responsible way by all of the different stakeholders. And ultimately, we're going to have patient harm caused by error because it's always going to be done by human beings. It's the same thing in the legal world. We make mistakes. So our responsibility becomes learning from them and taking care of the people who were involved. And those are not mutually exclusive terms. So the good news is it exists. It's right in front of us. We may even have policies about this in our hospital. And if you don't, please reach out to the collaborative. And we have additionally, we're signing up now for the second PACT collaborative, which is a collaborative effort between IHI, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, the collaborative out of the University of Washington College of Medicine, and Ariadne Labs, which is a joint effort between Harvard School of Public Health and Brigham and Women's Hospital. And it's essentially to create some of these health systems as cohorts with one another and go through a CRP building process together. And we're in the midst of PACT 1 cohort. And so please get more information, sign up. It's not very expensive. It's in a huge return on investment for your health systems. And we can then all work together to turn the Vanderbilt Nurse Case into an aberration and not a trend. And ultimately, I think that's what we all want. So CRPs reflect a living value of the corporate goals of patient autonomy, patient awareness, patient safety. We stop the harm, and we recognize the ethical paradigmatic shift that has occurred. And one of the ways we can empower to prevent our institutions from having these again, even if CRP is down the road for you, I would recommend highly that you, through the hospital itself, engage your defense panel, engage the plaintiff's bar, and engage with law enforcement and the DA and the attorney generals in your area, and let them understand, give them a glimpse into your quality processes, and that will give them a feeling that, okay, this is an institution that I'm more comfortable and I have more faith and trust that they're going to be able to self-police when an error like this happens. And they're going to respond in an ethically appropriate manner and learn from it, instead of capturing that story and, like Vanderbilt did, and shutting down the access to information to learn more about it, which we all do. I'm not indicting Vanderbilt for that. I've done, all of us who in our world, plaintiff or defendants, have settled cases early. And one of the things for the hospital is that we don't want anyone talking about it. We want a confidentiality agreement. So we're gonna have to re-envision the way we do a lot of that and to reflect this value. But they will offer assurances to you. Prosecutors, I believe, will offer assurances of a lack of interest to prosecute caregivers when you give them an idea of the patient safety values that you have and the way you live them as a cultural value. So only those of us on this call can really make this an aberration, not a trend. So that's where we go. We go with CRPs, we go with openness, we go with looking at an open mind to doing things different. And we ultimately, and Karen Brigham is on this call with me, we talk every single week. And after she and I, usually me, rants for a while, we come up with things we're going to actually do to try to kind of reverse the ethical, black hole of deny and defend, and look at doing things different. Litigation is always going to happen. But that's the conversation that we want to continue to have. And so we really encourage everybody to continue to access our webinars. We have lots of different type of content, learn more about the efforts of the collaborative, and we're happy to help in any way we can with that. So any other questions you're kind of seeing, Nicole?
Just one that may lead nice to the next section, more on where we go next, is do you think there'll be more transparency and disclosure of errors as a result of this?
Well, the concern is that there won't be. The concern is that, oh my God, look what happens when we do this. And I think that's the ultimate emergency that we face in healthcare. And we who live in it, representing the interests of healthcare providers, need to provide immediate assurance so that we don't have, we don't go too far the pendulum doesn't swing so far that we wind up scaring our people to say, oh my God, if I don't say this, no one will know about it. No one's going to look into it. And we reinforce a culture of what Karen and I have started calling the kitty litter box. When we make a mistake in healthcare, it's just, we do this and then we cover it up and it's not there anymore and no one talks about it because everybody else has their little lumps in their litter box too. So the most important thing is our response needs to be supportive and letting our own people know about our processes and our policies and our support for them. Many institutions, and the collaborative did a webinar series through its attorney alliance about the impacts of medical malpractice litigation on not only families of patients, but also caregivers, from the perspective of everybody involved in it, from defense and plaintiff lawyers and claims personnel. And one of the things that's really important is peer support. Having a portion of a good communication resolution program invokes peer support, so that when someone it makes a mistake, they're not demonized, they're not ostracized, like, oh my God, that's the guy or gal that did that. It's literally, because we all know we all do it. And so it's important to let those people know they're supported, and and they're brave and courageous and strong by coming forward and saying, I made a mistake here. I want people to learn about it. When we have a patient die on the table, we don't just go, oh, well, crap happens. They had a lot of comorbid factors. Let's go on down the road. If there's not a threat of litigation, typically we do a really good job of having grand rounds, conducting an M&M involving med students. If it's an academic institution, we want to learn about it. But the problem is, I think, and I think us as defense lawyers and bear a certain sense of responsibility for creating a fear of going through that process that ultimately is best interest for our clients. So I'm not sitting here pointing fingers at anybody. I'm saying this is something we all systemically have engaged in. And so that's, I think, one of the questions we got pre-hand was along that same line, Nicole, was a question we had before was, how can nurses let go of the nagging feeling that reporting near misses that do not harm the patient or even downright harm to the patient will result in punitive actions towards them? And the best thing I can say to that is, if you have a fully invested executive team that truly reflects the values that they espouse on the websites, that they tell you guys in your in-service trainings that they have, then that is, you don't just tell people that you have a peer assistance program. You explain it to them. You tell them who's involved in it. And that's what those kind of go hand in glove, is that, you don't just say, we're not going to take punitive action against you. Sometimes silence in return is a punitive action. We as healthcare providers need to also manage our own wellness and reach out to those peer assistance programs. And it's not just for, drug and alcohol abuse. Those are important, but a lot of peer support systems in some larger institutions, are, incredibly beneficial, because you can have an immediate mentor who's been in the same situation, in the same shoes as you have, to kind of guide you through that process. And a lot of times lawyers like me will say, oh my God, you can't do that. You might be discussing something that's privileged. We have to yield some of these claims of, privilege, 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 and find ways to help participate in that process. It's way better to invoke our privilege when we are a participant, as opposed to when we're sitting back wanting people to just not do anything unless it's done at our direction. So engage with each other, talk about it, build a support system. And if you're a facility or a system that doesn't have a peer support system for medical errors, then contact the collaborative, and we'll help you get with the people that'll create one with you. These are doable things that have tangible benefits and help create the culture where, it's not transparency and then we throw you in the ditch. It's transparency and then we support you and we celebrate you and we learn from what happened, and we're all going to be better because of it.
All right, we do have another question. Perhaps if there were stronger federal and state protections for quality safety and patient safety activities in healthcare, hospitals would not be forced to protect the data and information so fiercely in order not to violate privilege.
Okay, I think what they're saying there is better support for the quality functions that are being done rather than, I agree. I think the short answer is I agree. We do, and one of the collaboratives we had, one of our board members is involved with the Medical Liability Defense Federation, which is essentially they're lobbying Congress on all types of things. We get reports back from him, Mike Stinson, great guy, really smart man and well resourced. And so we're working and interested in collaborating with our health system partners on ways we can, to impact that. Because one of the things that we need to be very mindful of is we historically have come from a perspective that it's really hard to drive quality of care programs and change from a liability risk claims perspective. Even though we may be good at it at times and we may hit the mark a lot, there's an inherent feeling that that our motives are different than what they are in quality. And so I think it's important for quality and risk to have a lane in the CRP process, but not to be driving the train. We need to and that's one of the things historically, it's like, this is yours, this is mine, and we fight over all these other things. We don't define a role for each other in our respective business. There's absolutely a role for quality in all risk and claims, and vice versa. There's a role in risk and claims for all quality events that may not ever even result in litigation. And so one of the ways we can manifest that is by taking actions, doing lobbying efforts at the federal level to result in changes, because that's where the biggest change can be driven, is from third-party payers. Change being driven from the medical professional liability world is tough. There are so many insurance carriers. They're competitive with one another. There's no centralization. There's not that many even organizations where they all share in common. But what we're seeing is that if we don't get the bull by the horns on this, then we're going to have all of this stuff dictated to us by the third-party payers, because essentially they're going to realize and are realizing we're already in a trend towards, essentially addressing reimbursement rates with quality outcomes. It's not a far leap of imagination to believe that they will see the value in a model of CRPs, and you don't want to be too late to this game, and recognizing the benefits from it, as well as having that, reflecting the values of the third-party payers to provide good care to all of their patients in their pool.
All right, we do have another question from Dr. Perlman, and he says, the major medical organizations have been largely silent about this case, but what about the legal organizations?
Probably more silent. It's a great question, Doc, and I think, it's important that we not be. And I think there's been a lot of, outcries about from healthcare providers themselves about the fear of this happening to them, and they get behind the nurse, which I understand. I mean, it's, rallying to someone's cause who's worked a shift like you and done things that you've done and treated patients in a way that you have is really, it feels empowering, and I think that's great. But at the end of the day, we're not really doing anything to prevent something like this from happening again. What we have to do is take that same passion and fervor and commitment and a desire to feel supported and protected, and turn it inward in our institutions, and be the one And instead of being the one who gets in their car and drives 20 hours to Nashville to sit in a courtroom and support a nurse who's having this experience, if you take, I'm not condemning that by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying that passion could really be well invested in your system by becoming an advocate for CRP and these related programs, and being someone who helps change. And there's many ways that you can do that. And an email to any of the people on this call or myself, my email address is kyle@sdh.law. I welcome comments about this. I love to have conversations about it. I travel a lot for work. I'm always in somebody's town. Happy to have a coffee with anybody. These are the types of things that we need to be doing, is creating a community and supporting the community that exists through the collaborative to direct those efforts, because that's what is going to result in satisfying a change for this and a protection of nurses in like against licensing agencies and against criminal enforcement. Because as we all know, they're going to go after the low-hanging fruit like they did here. They're not going to go take the CEO of Vanderbilt and file criminal charges against him or her or their organization. It's a very difficult process to go through for that. It costs a lot of money. There's gonna be a lot of really expensive lawyers, probably from all over the country, flying in to defend that situation. Instead of a criminal defense lawyer sitting there with a nurse who's having to raise a GoFundMe page just to be able to get copies of all the exhibits. So once again, we have these power disparities. They exist against nurses. They exist against physicians. The institutions don't really find the consequences other than it's part of doing business. And good business is doing things for the interests of all the stakeholders involved.
Thank you so much. That just about brings us to the top of the hour. So I think it's a good time to wrap up today's session. I want to thank Kyle for sharing his knowledge and his wisdom and his time with us today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to email Kyle or the collaborative. Both emails are in the chat. And we look forward to having you join us again soon. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.